Welcome to the Crop Protection 101 training module for digital agronomy. Why does digital agronomy need to know the basics of crop protection? A good part of the answer to that question is that digital agronomy holds the key to helping growers address some very complex pest management issues. After this brief introduction, I will go on to describe how crop protection typically involves managing pests. We will then cover some of the effects of pests on crops and their impact. I will include some comments on pest origins and then provide an overview of how pests are managed and what some of the pest management challenges are. Finally, I will add some thoughts about the role of digital agronomy in addressing pest management in the future. When we speak of crop protection, we are typically referring to managing pests with products or services that nutrient markets to growers. And when we talk about pests, I want to be clear that the term pests includes insects, crop diseases, and weeds. But depending on the type of crop and the area of the country, pests also include mice, raccoons, birds, deer, crawfish, wild pigs, coyotes, voles, gophers, and rats. Although for our discussion today, I'll primarily focus on insects, diseases, and weeds. Perhaps the primary means by which pests reduce crop yields is by reducing the leaf area on crops, which reduces the photosynthetic efficiency. This typically occurs by insect feeding. But the effective area is also lost through plant tissue necrosis, by injection of toxins by insects, or the development of toxins within the plant by diseases. Some insects can cut plant stems, killing emerging seedlings, while some soil insects feed directly on the roots of crops. Weeds in a crop are competitors with the crop for sunlight, water, nutrients, and space. And just as every insect or disease will affect the crop differently, no two weed species will affect the crop the same. All weeds compete with the crop, reducing crop growth and yield. Just remember, there is no such thing as a good weed. Pests also affect grain quality. Insect parts, mouse droppings, and weed seed contaminate grain. Ergot of wheat is one example of many crop diseases that add toxic compounds in food, feed, or forage. And grain and produce of many kinds are spoiled in storage or have less protein, sugars, or starches as a result of pest infestations. Many times the losses of pests are essentially invisible. Note that in this photo the seeds look fine, but some are reduced in size as a result of a pest infestation that reduced the plant's vigor. This is quite common. Some diseases and insects of crop roots have no visible above-ground injury symptoms, which makes them very difficult to detect or treat. But then there are infestations and outbreaks that are very visible and extremely challenging. Here are just a few examples. From 1900 to the 1920s, cotton production was nearly impossible in the southern United States due to the boll weevil. Insecticides for boll weevil control are the only reason cotton production is an economically viable crop in the United States today. During the Dust Bowl days of 1931, grasshoppers of various species ate their way through many crops, significantly contributing to the collapse of much of the farm economy during the Great Depression. The oriental fruit fly was introduced in the 1940s to the United States and now threatens over 230 crops. More recently, the western corn rootworm has caused problems for corn producers throughout much of the Midwest. As their name implies, corn rootworms cut the roots of corn plants, making it difficult for corn to stand upright. I have seen entire fields of corn laying flat on the ground as a result of a crop that no longer had roots enough to hold it up. Crop disease outbreaks are common as well. In 1845, the potato late blight resulted in famine in Ireland and is still one of the most significant potato diseases here in the United States. In 1953, there was a wheat stem rust outbreak that devastated the wheat crop that year. In 2004, Asian soybean rust was introduced into the United States, greatly increasing the need for fungicides to maintain yields. And in 1973, southern corn leaf rust reduced U.S. corn yields by 35%. And more recently, in 2019, we have the Panama disease of bananas. This disease is reaching epidemic proportions and is putting banana production at risk across the world. There is currently no effective pesticide for control of this disease. Although weeds generally don't appear in what we might call outbreaks, there are many weeds that can cause as much crop loss as any disease or insect. Kudzu is a vine imported from Japan that has taken over much of the southeast United States, smothering trees and landscaping. Palmer amaranth, a weed that is native to the United States, is considered the most problematic weed for row crop production in the U.S. due to its resistance to numerous herbicides and its ability to produce hundreds of thousands of seed from a single plant. Another introduced species, Klamath weed, also known as St. John's wort, infests millions of grazing acres in the West and is toxic to the animals which graze on it. And then, of course, there is this plant, sometimes known as ditchweed, which is infesting backyards and basements all across the United States. The destructiveness of a pest varies depending on weather conditions that determine its rate of development. Some, like scab on wheat, like it cool and wet, while others, like grasshoppers, develop more quickly in hot and dry conditions. The more optimal the temperature and humidity conditions become for a pest, the more likely they are to be destructive to the crop. There are many other factors as well that affect pest levels and their impact on a crop. These include the type of tillage, crop rotation sequences, the effectiveness of previous pest controls, the overall general health of the crop, and the presence of other crops grown nearby that might be a reservoir for pests. Because no two fields have exactly the same parameters and conditions, the manner in which a pest should be managed will change from field to field. Figuring out which pests are going to be a problem and how best to manage them is a challenge. So, if you are a crop protection specialist, there's always something to look forward to. 700. That's the approximate number of insects, weed species, and crop diseases estimated to affect agronomic crops across the United States. So you might ask, where did they all come from? Many of our pests are native to North America and have flourished to become problems because we grow the crops that make an ideal environment for their development. However, some of our most destructive pests are introduced accidentally by riding along on plants or other products imported from overseas. A number of weeds were also introduced intentionally as garden flowers, pasture species, or as experimental species that just got out of control. While not all 700 pest species are critically important to crop production, almost every field will have a handful of pest species that growers have to be aware of and ready to manage each season. For example, it is not unusual for a farmer to have to manage from 5 to 10 destructive insect species, from 5 to 10 different crop diseases, and from 10 to 30 different weed species in a field sometime during the season. Some of those pests are present in a field every year, while others come and go depending on the weather. Most weeds, soil-borne diseases, and ground-dwelling insects are going to be in the field year after year. Some pests are moved from one location to another by tillage or harvest equipment. Others by trucks or trains moving grain along roadways or railways, and still others by animals of all kinds moving seed. And by wind and rain moving seeds, insects, and fungal spores. One of the most significant means of insect and crop disease dispersal are the winds that drive north from coastal states each spring and summer. This event happens every year and brings the spores of several important rust species and, rust diseases and flights of destructive insects into the Midwest. Two important insects that come up into the Midwest from the Gulf Coast each spring are black cutworms and armyworms. The moths hitch a ride on those southern winds, and when the moths find an attractive crop, they land and lay their eggs. The larvae that hatch from those eggs can be very destructive to many of our crops. Since some pests are migratory and they all develop at different rates, it's important for growers to know which pests have reached destructive levels. For flying insects, one of the more common means of determining pest levels is the use of pheromone traps, which lure flying insects into a device where they are later counted. Sticky traps, bright yellow colored cardboard coated with a glue, are also used for some insects. But for most crawling insects, crop diseases, and weeds, the most practical means of knowing what pest is where is to send someone into the field who has the knowledge and ability to correctly identify the pest and scout for problems. Currently, in our company's Echelon app, we have a pest scouting feature that helps our field agronomists monitor and track pest progress. As in the image at the left, the app has a feature which shows a heat map of where pest outbreaks are concentrated. The graph on the right shows chronologically how pest populations have varied throughout the season. There are a few of the more important pests, such as wheat leaf rust and wheat scab, that now have a mathematical model that forecasts pest presence and determines their destructive behavior in those crops. However, because there are many development factors that we do not yet know for most pests, the best way to determine if they are at economic levels in any field is to scout the field for those pests. While most of us instinctively think of pesticides when asked about pest control, the most important means of managing pests continues to be through cultural practices that disrupt the life cycle of the pest, including tillage, crop rotation, and field sanitation. Conventional breeding of crop varieties and hybrids is also important as it builds qualities in the crop that reduce the impact of a pest without having to use a pesticide. Over the last 30 years or so, biologicals, such as BT, which is a derivative of the Bacillus thuringiensis bacteria, are chemicals that are derived from living organisms but applied in a manner similar to pesticides. That is, they may be sprayed or deposited near the plant. And these have been widely adopted. Genetically modified crops have had material inserted into their genome from living organisms to produce a toxin within the plant itself. This reduces the need for inorganic pesticides that might have otherwise been necessary. Many of these GMO traits are found in the hybrid and variety seeds marketed by Nutrien. Finally, while these cultural and crop breeding practices are preferable wherever they can be used, pesticides are still playing a major role in suppressing pests. So, for Nutrien, what role do we play? What role does digital ag play? Well, we help the grower get the crop protection products they need. The amount of pesticide products sold in the United States is somewhere around $18 billion for all agricultural crops. Nutrien's share of that is somewhere about 15% of the U.S. total. So there is plenty of opportunity for progress to be made. Where in the crop protection market might those opportunities be? Most likely, they'll be found in the herbicide products. This chart displays the pounds of various types of pesticides used in the United States for agricultural uses. The agricultural sector in the United States uses about 100 million pounds of fungicide, 60 million pounds of insecticide, and about 680 million pounds of herbicide active ingredient each year. Supplying those products effectively and efficiently, particularly herbicides, is an opportunity for Nutrien and a way to bolster the economic health of both the grower and the company. However, even with hundreds of millions of pounds of pesticides being applied to crops, crop losses still remain significant. As indicated by the orange bars on this chart, the actual yield losses from each pest category of weeds, insects, and crop diseases are estimated at about 5%. So the overall actual yield loss from all categories of pests adds up to about 15% annually. The dark green bars show the estimated yield loss in the absence of pesticides. If we add up all those losses under the assumption that pesticides were not available, crop losses would range from 40 to 60% annually. But we should not forget that a primary role of pesticides has been to reduce the risk of growing crops in a monoculture or in a limited crop rotation. By reducing the number of crops grown on a farm or in a region of the country, we get increases in the efficiency of labor, equipment, grain storage, and land use. So pesticides are not just increasing yield, they are increasing the efficiency of crop production overall, and it is that efficiency that is keeping our world fed. What are the challenges and opportunities that face agriculture? Well, I am predicting that helping growers address pest resistance will be a real opportunity for digital ag. I am sure you have heard of insects developing resistance to an insecticide which had resulted from repeated use of that pesticide over time. But weeds and crop diseases also can develop resistance to a pesticide active ingredient when it is used repeatedly. The process of developing resistance is always the same. Somewhere in the genetic material of a weed, insect, or crop disease organism, there are mutations or alterations that allow an individual organism to survive a pesticide. When that survival happens and that individual then goes on to produce progeny, that progeny also has the ability to survive the pesticide until, over time, an entire population has developed with the ability to be resistant to that pesticide. Weed resistance to herbicides is likely to be one of the more formidable challenges in the decade ahead. Worldwide, there are over 500 weed species that have developed resistance to one or more classes or groups of herbicides. Here in the United States, some of the most aggressive and competitive weeds have developed resistance to several herbicide active ingredients. Pest resistance, especially weed resistance to herbicides, leaves farmers facing a real dilemma. There are about 1,500 herbicide products from which to choose, but with new weeds developing resistance to different herbicides each year, only a very few of those herbicides are left to control some of the most competitive weed species and yet still fit the crop and growers' production practices. Here is a very simplified version of how herbicides are selected for row crops. First, the grower determines the crop to be grown. Next, the grower determines what herbicide tolerance traits the crop will have, if any. Third, the grower identifies the weed species he knows are problems in this field. Fourth and fifth, he then notes which of those weed species already exhibit resistance in his field or have a high probability of developing resistance. Sixth, the grower then prioritizes the weeds that are most important to manage at the highest level. Seventh, the grower then identifies which herbicides are labeled for the crop and the crop genetic traits that he selected to be grown in the field. Eighth, the grower then must eliminate from that list of herbicides any that would tend to accelerate resistance development in the weeds. Ninth, the grower chooses from among the remaining few herbicides one or two, which will adequately control the weeds in the field. Finally, the grower would repeat this process for each of his 20 to 40 fields. Yeah, if you were a bit confused by that explanation, you would fit right in with most growers. With so many herbicide products from which to choose, and with some weed species having tolerance or resistance to as many as 2/3 of all active ingredients, it gets tough to make the right choice. So, with things being so complex, how do growers make their weed control decisions? Well, a great many of them just use the same products they used previously, figuring that it did well enough for them in the past, so why not use it again? But using the same active ingredient products repetitively is a quick path that leads to resistance development in pests. And that's why we end up with so many fields looking like this when they should look like this. I believe that digital agronomy has a role in helping the grower with this decision-making process. We can help the grower filter out bad choices and present the grower with alternative products from our own inventory that are well suited for managing it or minimizing the development of resistant pests. If we can do this, real wealth can be created as digital agronomy improves the profit margin for growers. While Nutrien provides seed, fertilizer, and crop protection products, it's up to digital agronomy to provide the additional critical component of data and information that sees those products get to the right place at the right time. If we are to maintain an efficient crop production system in North America, it won't happen without information passing through data services. Digital Ag provides that platform. In summary, there is a wide range of pests affecting agricultural crops, but their destructiveness varies greatly among pests. Pests are both native and introduced, and some move very little while others are migratory. The more destructive pests must be monitored to determine if and when they should be controlled. Pests are managed by both cultural methods and by pesticides. And finally, due to the complexity of managing resistant pests, there may be real opportunities for digital ag to assist growers with this challenge. Thank you.